1974, in an office at James Cook University in Townsville, a gardener named Eddie Mabo is having lunch with two historians, Noel Luce and Henry Reynolds, and the conversation drifts to his home, a small island called Mer, way out in the Torres Strait. Mabo starts talking about his land back there, the land he's always understood, without question, to be his. The two historians glance at each other. They know something Mabo doesn't. Under Australian law, the land he's talking about isn't his at all. It's Crown land, the property of the Queensland Government, the same as practically every other square metre of this country that hadn't been specifically granted to someone by the Crown itself. Mabo's response, recorded by both men afterward, was immediate and blunt. No way. It's not theirs. It's ours. That lunchtime conversation is, as much as any single moment can be, where the most significant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal case in Australian history actually began. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Wadjuk Nyungar country, and we acknowledge the Wadjuk Nyungar people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about Eddie Koiki Mabo, the 10-year legal fight that carried his name, and the High Court decision that finally tore up the legal fiction this entire country had been built on for 200 years. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses historical land dispossession, a lengthy legal battle, and the death of its central figure before the case he'd spent a decade fighting for was finally decided. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any hour of the day or night, on 139276. Alright, let's go back to who Eddie Mabo actually was, because the case that carries his name only makes sense once you understand the life that led him there. Eddie Koiki Mabo was born in 1936 in the village of Lass, on Mer, also known as Murray Island, in the eastern Torres Strait. His mother died shortly after his birth, and under Meriam custom, he was adopted and raised by his maternal uncle and aunt, Benny and Maiga Mabo, whose surname he took as his own. He grew up speaking both Meriam Mir and English in a community with its own deeply structured system of land ownership, passed down through families and individual holdings, going back as far as anyone could remember, a system entirely separate from, and considerably more detailed than, the kind of broad tribal land ownership often assumed to be the only model that existed across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. When Mabo was around 16, a local court on Mer convicted him of drinking alcohol and banished him from the island for a year, sending him out to work on fishing boats in the meantime. He served that punishment. What he didn't get back, afterward, was permission to return home permanently. Years later, while working as a research assistant on an oral history project in the Torres Strait, Mabo made it as far as Thursday Island and was refused permission to land on any of the other islands, Mer included, because by then he'd built a public reputation as a political radical, and that reputation alone was treated as grounds to keep him away from his own home. He was, in the most literal sense, landless under the law, and exiled from his own community at the same time. In 1957, Mabo moved permanently to the Australian mainland, settling eventually in Townsville. He worked as a cane cutter, a railway construction labourer, and a wharf worker for the Townsville Harbour Board, while becoming increasingly involved in union representation and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advocacy, representing Torres Strait Islander workers on the Townsville to Mount Isa rail construction project in the early 1960s. He married Benita Nihau, an Australian South Sea Islander woman, in 1959, and the couple eventually raised 10 children together. In 1962, he became secretary of the Aboriginal Advancement League in Townsville, and by 1970, he was president of the Council for the Rights of Indigenous People, building, across roughly 2 decades, the kind of extensive activist network and reputation that would later prove essential when his land case needed serious legal and political backing. In 1967, the same year the country voted on the referendum we covered in our last episode, an effort Mabo himself actively campaigned for, he took a job as a gardener at James Cook University, a role he held for close to a decade. He spent his lunch breaks reading academic anthropology texts about his own people, written, almost entirely, by outsiders, including a 6-volume 19th century anthropological survey of the Torres Strait that he worked through page by page and sitting in on university lectures whenever the timing allowed. In 1973, concerned that his own children were losing connection to Torres Strait Islander language and culture growing up on the mainland, Mabo co-founded the Black Community School in Townsville, alongside fellow activist Harry Penrith, later known as Burnham, where children learned standard subjects alongside Merriam language and cultural knowledge, and served as its director for over a decade. That university job is where the conversation we opened with happened in 1974. The shock of that discovery didn't fade. In 1981, Mabo helped organise a conference at James Cook University titled Land Rights and the Future of Australian Race Relations, and gave a speech explaining, in careful detail, exactly how land inheritance actually worked on Mer, family by family, plot by plot. In the audience that day was a lawyer who recognised something the rest of the room might have missed, that what Mabo had just described had real, serious standing under existing legal doctrine, and that someone should test it directly in court. A Perth-based solicitor named Greg McIntyre, also in attendance, agreed to take the case, and brought in barristers Ron Caston and Brian Keon Cohen to argue it. On the 20th of May, 1982, Mabo, alongside 4 other Merriam people, Reverend David Passy, Sam Passy, Tseluia Mapo Saleh, and James Rice, filed an action in the High Court of Australia against the state of Queensland and the Commonwealth, seeking formal legal recognition that they owned land on Mer under their own traditional custom and law. Queensland didn't wait quietly for a verdict. In 1985, while the case was still working its way through the courts, the state government passed the Queensland Coast Islands Declaratory Act, a law specifically designed to retroactively extinguish any traditional land rights the Murray Islanders might have had, dating all the way back to when Queensland had first annexed the islands in 1879, and to do so without paying a cent of compensation to anyone, regardless of what the High Court eventually found about the underlying merits of the Merriam claim. It was about as direct an attempt to legislate a court case out of existence as Australian legal history has on record, an entire state parliament moving to retrospectively erase the very thing 5 of its own citizens were asking a court to recognise. It backfired. In 1988, in what became known as Mabo No. 1, the High Court struck that law down entirely, ruling by a 4-3 majority that it was inconsistent with the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, since it singled out Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander property rights, specifically for extinguishment in a way no other Australian's property rights could legally be treated, a direct breach of equality before the law. That ruling cleared the path for the substantive case, Mabo No. 2, to finally proceed to a full hearing on its actual merits. The case ground on for a full decade. 33 Merriam people, including the 5 plaintiffs themselves, gave evidence across the proceedings, generating around 4,000 pages of transcript, establishing in exhaustive, granular detail that the 8 clans of Mer had occupied clearly defined, individually held territories on the island for hundreds of years. With an unbroken continuity of custom, the court could not reasonably dismiss as invented or imagined. Eddie Mabo did not live to see how it ended. He was diagnosed with cancer in 1990 and died on the 21st of January 1992 in Brisbane at 55 years old. Just months later, on the 3rd of June that year, the High Court handed down its decision in Mabo v. Queensland, No. 2. 6 of the 7 judges ruled in the Merriam people's favour. By that point, 3 of the original 5 plaintiffs, Mabo himself, Sam Passy, and Seluia Mapo Salih, had already died without ever hearing the verdict. The ruling itself dismantled something that had underpinned Australian property law since the very first days of British settlement, the doctrine of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, the legal fiction that had let Britain claim sovereignty over this entire continent on the assumption Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had no organised system of law or land ownership capable of being recognised at all. The High Court rejected that fiction outright, finding that native title, rights to land arising from a group's own traditional law and custom, had existed before colonisation, had never automatically been extinguished by the Crown's assertion of sovereignty, and could still be legally recognised today, wherever it hadn't subsequently been validly extinguished by some other lawful act. It was the first time in the court's history, since its own establishment back in 1901, that this exact question had been properly put to it and answered. Then Prime Minister Paul Keating, in his Redfern speech delivered later that same year, praised the decision as one that established a fundamental truth and laid the basis for justice. Within 12 months, the Federal Parliament passed the Native Title Act of 1993, creating a formal legal framework and a National Native Title Tribunal, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups across the entire country could pursue their own claims using the same basic legal pathway Mabo and his co-plaintiffs had spent 10 years forcing open. It's worth being honest about what native title actually is and isn't, because the popular memory of Mabo sometimes treats it as a simple, sweeping handback of land to its original owners. It isn't that. Native title can be, and frequently still is, extinguished by valid grants of freehold title, pastoral leases, or other government decisions made at almost any point in the 2 centuries since colonisation, and proving a continuous, unbroken connection to country, exactly the kind of detailed evidence the Meriam people spent a full decade assembling, remains a difficult, expensive, and often deeply painful process for communities to undertake, frequently requiring exactly the same kind of exhaustive genealogical and cultural documentation Mabo's own case relied on. Claims can take years, sometimes decades to resolve, and the legal burden of proof sits squarely with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander claimants, who have to demonstrate their connection has survived intact, rather than with governments having to prove it was ever legitimately extinguished in the first place. Some Mabo-era native title outcomes have produced genuine freehold ownership, as happened for the traditional owners of Bardu Island in 2014, who received freehold title to close to 10,000 hectares of their own land. Many others have produced more limited rights, access, use, and cultural protection, without full ownership in the way most Australians would casually understand that word. A further High Court case 4 years later, Wick Peoples versus Queensland in 1996, clarified that native title could coexist alongside pastoral leases in many circumstances, refining the doctrine further, but also triggering its own fierce political backlash and a federal government response known at the time as the 10-Point Plan, a story that deserves its own episode on this show. Eddie Mabo's name has outlasted the legal technicalities, though. The 3rd of June is now marked annually as Mabo Day, falling during National Reconciliation Week, an official holiday in his home region of the Torres Strait. He was posthumously awarded the Australian Human Rights Medal in 1992, alongside his surviving co-plaintiffs, and named Australian of the Year by the Australian newspaper that same year. James Cook University named its Townsville library after him in 2008, runs an annual lecture series in his honour delivered each year on Mabo Day, and a television film based on his life, starring Jimmy Banney, aired nationally in 2012. His wife Benita, who stood beside him through the entire 10-year fight and well beyond it, continued advocating for Indigenous and human rights for decades afterward, receiving an honorary doctorate from James Cook University in November of 2018, just days before she died. His daughter Gail Mabo has gone on to become a respected visual artist, and now serves as her family's spokesperson, continuing to tell her father's story in her own words. His family's reach has continued in some unexpected directions too. His great-nephew, Paddy Mills, became the 3rd Indigenous Australian to represent the country in Olympic basketball, carrying the Mabo name into an entirely different kind of national recognition decades after that lunchtime conversation in a university office. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. A gardener who discovered, almost by accident, over lunch, that the land his family had always considered theirs legally belonged to the Crown. A man banished from his own home island as a teenager, then refused permission to return for years afterward simply for becoming politically outspoken. A state government that tried to legislate his case out of existence and got that very attempt struck down instead. A 10-year legal fight built on 4,000 pages of patiently assembled evidence about who held which plot of land on one small island in the Torres Strait. A man who died 5 months before he found out he'd won. And a legal doctrine, terra nullius, that had quietly underpinned 2 centuries of dispossession across this entire continent, finally, formally declared a fiction by the highest court in the land. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with just how recent this all is. 1992 isn't ancient history. There are people in their late 30s and early 40s right now who were already alive when the doctrine that this entire country's land law had rested on for 2 centuries was still considered settled, unquestioned law. Eddie Mabo didn't uncover some forgotten historical wrong from centuries past. He spent the last 18 years of his life fighting a legal fiction that was still actively, currently being applied against his own family in his own lifetime, right up until the moment it finally fell. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a Three Brothers production. I'll see you next time.